What happens when Hollywood's most iconic tough guy meets television's most controversial host in a collision that nobody saw coming? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with Bill Maher for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of Real Time with Bill Maher started like any other. The studio audience was buzzing with anticipation as the legendary Clint Eastwood, now 94 years old but still commanding respect across Hollywood, made his entrance. Dressed in his signature understated style, a simple dark jacket and white shirt, Eastwood moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. The audience erupted in applause, a mixture of genuine admiration and nervous energy that seemed to charge the entire studio. Maher, sporting his typical smug grin, welcomed the cinematic icon with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a true American legend here tonight," Maher announced, his voice carrying that familiar tone of self-importance his regular viewers had come to expect. "Clint Eastwood, the man who made my day for decades." The audience laughed at the reference. But there was something in Eastwood's expression, a slight tightening around the eyes, that suggested he wasn't entirely amused by the host's attempt at humor. As they settled into their chairs, the initial conversation flowed smoothly enough. Maher asked about Eastwood's latest projects, his thoughts on the current state of Hollywood, and his legendary career spanning over 6 decades. Eastwood, ever the professional, answered with his characteristic economy of words, each response measured and deliberate. But seasoned viewers of both men could sense an underlying tension building beneath the surface pleasantries. The first crack in the facade appeared when Maher, unable to resist his compulsive need to inject politics into every conversation, began steering the discussion toward more controversial territory. "You know, Clint, you've been pretty vocal about your political views over the years," Maher said, leaning forward with that predatory gleam in his eyes that regular viewers recognized as a warning sign. "And I have to say, some of your positions have been, well, let's call them interesting." Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've always believed in speaking my mind," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience dealing with Hollywood's political correctness. "That's what this country was built on, the freedom to express your thoughts without fear of persecution." Maher chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Persecution? Come on, Clint. You're one of the most successful actors and directors in history. I think you can handle a little criticism." The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in atmosphere. What had started as a celebration of a Hollywood legend was beginning to feel more like an ambush. "Criticism is one thing," Eastwood responded, his voice steady, but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "But when people try to silence others simply because they disagree with their views, that's something else entirely." He paused, fixing Maher with a stare that had intimidated countless actors and crew members over the years. "That's not criticism, that's cowardice." The tension in the studio became palpable. Maher's usual confidence seemed to waver for just a moment before he regained his composure. "Cowardice? That's a strong word, Clint. I mean, we're just having a conversation here." But his tone suggested he was anything but interested in a mere conversation. This was beginning to feel like a setup, and everyone in the room could sense it. Eastwood leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You know, Bill, I've been doing interviews for over 60 years. I can usually tell when someone's trying to make a point rather than ask a question." The audience was dead silent now, hanging on every word. "So why don't you just say what you really want to say?" Maher's mask slipped completely. "All right, fine. Let's talk about your support for certain political figures, who shall remain nameless," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "How do you reconcile that with your image as this moral, upstanding American hero?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a cold fury that had been building since the moment he sat down. "Moral, upstanding," he repeated slowly. "You want to talk about morality, Bill? Let's talk about the morality of ambushing a 94-year-old man on your show, just to score political points with your audience." The studio erupted in murmurs. This was no longer a typical late-night interview. This was a confrontation, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Maher, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far, tried to backtrack. "Now hold on, Clint. I'm not ambushing anyone. I'm just asking legitimate questions that my viewers want answered." But Eastwood was having none of it. Legitimate questions? His voice remained controlled, but there was steel beneath the surface. "You invited me here under the pretense of discussing my career, my films, my contributions to cinema. Instead, you want to put me on trial for my political beliefs." He shook his head slowly. "I've seen this playbook before, Bill. You're not as original as you think you are." The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by the unfolding drama. Maher, his usual smugness replaced by something approaching desperation, made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. "Look, Clint, I respect your right to your opinions, but when you have a platform like yours, don't you think you have a responsibility to—" "Responsibility," Eastwood interrupted, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "You want to lecture me about responsibility? You, who make a living mocking and belittling anyone who doesn't share your worldview?" The legendary actor leaned forward, his gaze boring into Maher with an intensity that made the host visibly uncomfortable. "I've been responsible to my craft, to my family, to my country, and to my principles for nearly a century. I don't need lectures from someone who's made a career out of cheap shots and gotcha moments." The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, and everyone in the studio could feel it. What had started as subtle tension was now an open conflict between two men who represented entirely different philosophies about discourse, respect, and the role of celebrity in society. The audience watched in stunned silence as their beloved host found himself outmatched by a man who had faced down countless challenges both on and off screen. Maher, clearly rattled but unwilling to back down, made what would prove to be a fatal mistake. "Well, Clint, at least I'm not afraid to take a stand. Some of us believe in using our platforms for good, not just pandering to—" But he never got to finish that sentence. What happened next would shock everyone present and set the stage for one of the most dramatic exits in television history. Eastwood's hand came down on the arm of his chair with a sharp crack that echoed through the stunned silence of the studio. The sound was so unexpected, so filled with controlled fury, that several audience members actually jumped in their seats. When the legendary actor spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience dealing with Hollywood's elite and their games. "That's enough," Eastwood said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "I've sat here and listened to your sanctimonious lecture long enough." His eyes, still sharp despite his age, fixed on Maher with an intensity that made the host visibly shrink back in his chair. "You want to talk about taking a stand? Let me tell you about taking a stand, Bill." The studio cameras captured every moment as Eastwood slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and commanding. Even at 94, he possessed a presence that filled the room. Suddenly, Maher looked very small behind his desk. "I've taken stands when it mattered," Eastwood continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've taken stands when there were real consequences, not just Twitter backlash and hurt feelings." Maher, clearly panicked by the turn of events, tried to regain control of his show. "Clint, please sit down. We can discuss this like civilized people." but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the nervousness he was desperately trying to hide. The audience could sense his fear, and it only made Eastwood's dominance more pronounced. Civilized? Eastwood's laugh was cold and humorless. There's nothing civilized about what you just tried to do. You invited me here under false pretenses, waited until I was comfortable, then tried to ambush me with your political agenda. He took a step closer to Maher's desk, and the host instinctively leaned back. That's not journalism, Bill. That's a hit job. The tension in the studio was now so thick you could cut it with a knife. Audience members were looking around nervously, unsure whether they should be witnessing this confrontation or look away. The camera operators, seasoned professionals who had seen countless heated exchanges, kept their equipment focused on the unfolding drama, knowing they were capturing something unprecedented. Maher made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Look, Clint, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just trying to have an honest conversation about... About what? Eastwood interrupted, his voice rising. About how you think anyone who doesn't share your political views is somehow morally inferior? About how you believe you have the right to lecture people who've accomplished more in their little finger than you have in your entire career. The words hit like physical blows, and Maher visibly flinched with each accusation. The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by the raw emotion and barely controlled fury radiating from the Hollywood legend. This wasn't the carefully scripted banter they were used to seeing on late-night television. This was real, unfiltered confrontation between two men who represented completely different worldviews. I've been making movies since before you were born, Eastwood continued, his voice steady but filled with controlled rage. I've employed thousands of people, created art that will outlast both of us, and served my country in ways you couldn't possibly understand. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And you think you can sit there and judge me? You think you can question my character because I don't toe your political line? Maher's usual smugness had completely evaporated. He was now desperately trying to de-escalate a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. Clint, I never meant to imply... Of course you did, Eastwood cut him off sharply. That's exactly what you meant to imply. You brought me here to make an example of me, to show your audience how even Hollywood legends can be brought down a peg if they step out of line. His eyes never left Maher's face. Well, congratulations, Bill. You've certainly made an example of someone tonight. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, and everyone in the studio could feel they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of Maher's humiliation and Eastwood's righteous fury. Maher, realizing his show was completely out of control, made one final desperate attempt to regain some semblance of authority. This is my show, Clint. I think you're overreacting to what was meant to be a simple discussion about current events. The words hung in the air for a moment before Eastwood responded. When he did, his voice was so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the entire studio. Your show? He repeated slowly. Your show? A bitter smile crossed his face. You're absolutely right, Bill. This is your show. And this is exactly the kind of show you've made it. A place where respect means nothing, where experience counts for nothing, where the only thing that matters is conformity to your narrow worldview. The legendary actor moved even closer to Maher's desk, his presence overwhelming the smaller man. You know what I've learned in my 94 years on this earth? I've learned that there are two kinds of people in this world, those who earn respect through their actions and those who demand it through their position. He leaned forward slightly. Guess which one you are, Bill? The insult landed like a physical blow, and Maher's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. The audience could see him struggling to maintain his composure, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. Now wait, just a minute. No, Eastwood interrupted, his voice like thunder. "You wait. You've had your say. You've made your little speech about platforms and responsibility and taking stands. Now it's my turn." The studio was so quiet that the only sound was the hum of the cameras and the barely audible breathing of the transfixed audience. "I've been taking stands since before you knew what a stand was," Eastwood continued, his voice building to a crescendo. "I took a stand when I decided to direct films that meant something instead of just chasing box office numbers. I took a stand when I refused to play the Hollywood game of fake smiles and empty promises. I took a stand when I spoke my mind, even when it wasn't popular." He paused, his gaze boring into Maher. "And I'm taking a stand right now." The confrontation had reached its absolute peak, with Eastwood towering over the now cowering talk show host like an avenging angel. The audience was holding its collective breath, sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. The cameras captured every moment of the drama, from Maher's obvious terror to Eastwood's controlled fury. What happened next would cement this confrontation as one of the most shocking moments in television history. As the legendary actor prepared to deliver the knockout blow that would leave Bill Maher speechless and set the stage for the most dramatic exit ever witnessed on live television, Eastwood straightened to his full height. His weathered face was set in stone as he looked down at the trembling talk show host. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had commanded respect for nearly a century. "You want to know what real courage looks like, Bill? Real courage isn't hiding behind a desk and taking cheap shots at people who've accomplished more than you ever will. Real courage is standing up to bullies like you." The words hit Maher like a physical assault, and the host's face went pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of television's most notorious provocateurs found himself completely speechless, reduced to a quivering mess by the sheer force of Eastwood's presence. "I've dealt with studio executives who thought they could push me around," Eastwood continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've dealt with critics who tried to tear down everything I've built. I've dealt with politicians who thought they could use me for their own purposes." He leaned forward, placing both hands on Maher's desk. "But I've never dealt with someone as pathetic as you." The insult reverberated through the studio like a gunshot. Several audience members gasped audibly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The cameras captured every moment of Maher's humiliation, from the sweat beading on his forehead to the way his hands shook as he gripped his desk. "You sit here night after night, safe in your little bubble, surrounded by people who laugh at your jokes and applaud your opinions," Eastwood pressed on relentlessly. "You think that makes you powerful? You think that makes you important?" His laugh was cold and bitter. "You're nothing but a court jester, Bill. A performer whose only talent is making people feel superior to others." Maher finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Clint, please, I think we should—" "Should what?" Eastwood roared, his composure finally cracking. "Should pretend this never happened? Should go back to your scripted questions and fake laughter? Should let you continue to poison the discourse with your sanctimonious garbage?" He shook his head violently. "Not tonight, Bill. Tonight, someone finally tells you the truth." The studio erupted in chaos. Some audience members began to applaud, while others sat in shocked silence. The production crew scrambled behind the cameras, unsure whether to cut to commercial or continue filming what was clearly television history in the making. Through it all, Eastwood stood like a pillar of righteous fury, his eyes never leaving Maher's face. "You want to know what's wrong with this country?" Eastwood continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. "It's people like you who think they have the right to judge others based on their political beliefs. It's people like you who think disagreement equals moral failure. It's people like you who have forgotten that respect is earned. not demanded. Maher tried desperately to regain control of his show, his voice cracking with emotion. "This is completely uncalled for. I was just trying to have a conversation." "A conversation?" Eastwood's voice dripped with contempt. "You call ambushing a guest with loaded questions and moral lectures a conversation? You call trying to humiliate someone for their beliefs a conversation?" He straightened up, towering over the cowering host. "Let me tell you what a real conversation looks like. Bill, it involves respect, honesty, and the basic human decency that you've clearly forgotten." The confrontation reached its climax as Eastwood delivered the final blow that would end not just the interview but potentially Maher's credibility as a host. "I've spent my entire career creating things that matter, telling stories that inspire people, bringing characters to life that will be remembered long after we're both gone." His voice was steady now, controlled, but filled with an intensity that made everyone in the studio hang on every word. "What have you created, Bill? What's your legacy going to be? A lifetime of tearing others down to build yourself up?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Maher's face had gone from pale to ashen, and his mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. The audience watched in fascination as the man who had made a career out of embarrassing others found himself completely and utterly destroyed by someone who had truly earned the right to speak with such authority. "I came here tonight out of respect for your audience," Eastwood continued, his voice now carrying the weight of finality. "I came here to talk about my work, my experiences, maybe share some stories that people might find interesting or inspiring." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Instead, I find myself dealing with a small-minded bully who thinks his platform gives him the right to attack anyone who doesn't share his narrow worldview." The studio was so quiet now that the only sound was the hum of the cameras and the barely audible breathing of the transfixed audience. Even the production crew had stopped moving, mesmerized by the unprecedented destruction of their host's credibility. Eastwood began to move away from Maher's desk, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "You know what the real tragedy is, Bill? You had a chance to have a real conversation with someone who's lived through nearly a century of American history. Someone who's seen this country change, who's been part of that change, who might have had something valuable to share." He shook his head sadly. "Instead, you chose to play your little political games." As Eastwood walked toward the edge of the set, Maher finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate plea. "Clint, wait, please, let's start over. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Eastwood stopped and turned back, his face set in stone. "There's been no misunderstanding, Bill. This is exactly who you are. This is exactly what your show has become. And this is exactly why I'm leaving." He looked directly into the camera, addressing the audience at home. "To anyone watching this, remember that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions, your integrity, and your willingness to treat others with basic human decency." The legendary actor began removing his microphone with slow, deliberate movements, each action carrying the weight of final judgment. "I've been in this business for over 60 years, and I've learned that there are two types of people: those who build others up and those who tear them down." He placed the microphone on a nearby table and looked back at Maher one final time. "Tonight, everyone got to see which type you are." The studio erupted as Eastwood began his exit. Some audience members rose to their feet, applauding the legendary actor's stand against what they saw as unfair treatment. Others sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Through it all, Maher remained frozen behind his desk, his usual smugness replaced by the hollow look of a man who had just been thoroughly and publicly humiliated. As Eastwood reached the exit, he paused and delivered his final words to the shell-shocked host. "Good luck with your show, Bill. You're going to need it." With that, the Hollywood legend walked off the set, leaving behind a studio full of stunned spectators and a host whose credibility lay in ruins. The cameras continued to roll as Maher sat in silence, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as he tried to process what had just happened. The audience watched in fascination as the man who had made a career out of having the last word found himself completely speechless, destroyed by someone who had truly earned the right to speak with such devastating authority. What had started as a simple promotional interview had become one of the most shocking confrontations in television history. Clint Eastwood, delivering a masterclass in how to handle a bully and walking away with his dignity intact, leaving his tormentor in ruins.